the very first thing I did,
Mhm.
because there were no functioning banks at the time in Cambodia, was to stop in Bangkok and go to the Chase Bank and withdraw like $50,000 in cash and
Yeah.
carry it
I
into
can
Cambodia.
see me. I'll be the eyes so that I just can be.
This is another episode of a special series called Enough for All of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. This series sheds light on 75 years of an NGO called CWS. My name is Maurice Bloem and I welcome you to another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen of the special series about church world service. And I really am delighted with today's guest because she has worked for CWS twice, at least that I know of, maybe more. We will hear that soon. Linda, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Maurice. It's great to be with you and your listeners. I'm Linda Hartke. At the moment, I'm serving as the Interim Vice President for Operations at Church World Service. But I've had a long experience working both in politics and government and with faith-based organizations. And as you mentioned, my first stint with Church World Service was as the country director at CWS in Cambodia from 1992 to 1998. Then I moved to New York to work at the headquarters as the deputy director for about 3 years. And now I'm back decades later, supporting some organizational development at CWS as they have a focus on governance, on operations, on policies and procedures.
Before we go there, Linda, do you still remember the first time you had heard about Church World Service?
Yes, the first time I would have heard about Church World Service was when my local church in Sudbury, Massachusetts, did a crop walk. And I participated in crop walks as a young person, and then many years later as well. I would say the other kind of important moment when I recognized the work and the value of CWS was when I was working on Capitol Hill as the chief of staff to my congressman. And we had a particular policy focus on issues related to refugees. The district Chet represented included Lowell, Massachusetts, with a large Southeast Asian refugee community. And CWS was really on the front lines as advocates for good policies and for welcoming refugees to the United States.
Okay. Were you born and raised in Massachusetts?
No, I was born in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, when
Okay.
my dad was in grad school. And then we lived in upstate New York and moved to Massachusetts when I was in the 4th grade.
Okay, yeah. And ultimately, where and what did you study?
I did undergraduate studies at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, with a double major in government and religion and biblical literature.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so how did you, and from there you ended up on the Hill?
From college, I first went to work in Democratic politics in Massachusetts. I worked for the Democratic Party in the state. I managed some political campaigns, and ultimately managed the campaign of the party chairman, who was my state senator also, who then was elected to Congress. And then I went to DC as his chief of staff.
Wow. And how long did you do this, Linda?
Let's see. I was in DC for to say it was 6 or 7 years.
Oh, quite a long
Yeah.
time. So why did you not continue then in politics? Because you ended up ultimately with CWS. So
Yeah, so the work in Washington, because of the particular focus on refugee policy, was something that really impacted me significantly personally, motivated me to want to have an experience living and working overseas and working with refugees. So after a re-election campaign and all that goes with that every 2 years, I was ready for a change. And so decided that I wanted to go and work in Cambodia. So I started reaching out to organizations that I knew that worked there to see what might be possible. And that's then how I reconnected with CWS and led to the opportunity to work there.
And why Cambodia?
Well, again, it was largely because of the experience. The district that the congressman represented had a very, very large Cambodian refugee community. So it was a community that I knew from the refugees who'd been resettled, and a set of issues I knew from a public policy perspective. So that made it interesting. It was also a unique time. It was the time just after the Paris Peace Accords, when a UN peacekeeping mission was about to be deployed, and refugees were about to be repatriated to Cambodia. So a time of significant change that was going to be fascinating to be a part of.
Okay. And so you applied for a job in Cambodia with CWS, and what did you have to do in Cambodia?
Well, so I started in Cambodia. The very first thing I did, because there were no functioning banks at the time in Cambodia, was to stop in Bangkok and go to the Chase Bank and withdraw like $50,000 in cash and carry it into Cambodia, which taught me from day one that things were not going to be what I expected. And
I'm laughing for the listeners because, you know, Linda, now at the moment you have been hired to really streamline our systems and procedures. So this is really funny. So this was many years ago, right? I mean,
it was many years ago. So the work in Cambodia was changing because the country was opening up. The embargo was being lifted. The UN, other development agencies were coming in. Governments like the US were beginning to open missions, and ultimately embassies as well. So it also meant it was a time for really reflection and thinking about CWS's work. The work there historically had been support for Cambodian government institutions, particularly the veterinary department, the agronomy department, and the hydrology department. And the evolution that took place during the time I was there was we transitioned away from funding and supporting government institutions. We helped them and coached them as they began to partner with USAID and the Asian Development Bank and the like. And we began to work more directly with local communities and with the newly forming Cambodian NGOs.
And so when you went there, how big was the CWS office?
The CWS office would have been probably about 15 people.
Okay.
Maybe 10. Yeah, 10 or 15. And that included, you know, cleaners and drivers and night guards and the like. So it was quite small, with expatriate staff from several countries. Again, all based in Phnom Penh, because at that time, initially, it wasn't possible to have expatriate staff travel outside of Phnom Penh. That changed. And of course, the work moved out to the provinces.
Yeah. And what was your job? You know?
So I joined CWS as the assistant director, and within about 5 or 6 months was the country director.
Oh, wow.
And
went fast. So who was the country director when you
it was a fellow named Peter Laramie.
Okay.
Who had was American, had lived in Thailand most of his life, had gone to Thailand as a Peace Corps volunteer and stayed.
Mm-hmm. And I forgot to ask you, who hired you in the US? Who was there? How did that go? You know, did you have several rounds of interviews? And
yeah, I mean, several rounds of interviews, but the hiring manager was Lonnie Turnipseed at the time.
And who has been on this podcast as well. So
yes.
You know, listeners, if they did not listen to that, for sure should check that out, because he has a lot of experiences that he shared as well. So important for CWS. Okay, that's interesting. That's great. And so how? So 5-6 months in, you become the boss. That's fast. You still have to learn the country. So and then ultimately, how many years were you there? I mean, and what are you most proud of when you look back? You know, of what you were able to achieve with the team over there.
Yeah. So I was there just over 6 years. And saw the UN peacekeeping mission arrive and saw it leave. One would like to think democracy was restored to Cambodia, but I can't quite say that was the case. But at least there was more public participation in decision-making, more transparency in government, multiple political parties. So that was all good. You know, I would say the things I was proudest about was some initial support we gave to the formation and the strengthening of some Cambodian NGOs, particularly those that worked with women and those that worked in the human rights sector. And also, along with a group of 5 other international NGOs, we formed a new organization to support training and organizational development for Cambodian staff of NGOs. And eventually that entity flourished on its own, could stand on its own, was more than financially viable and doing great work in terms of building capacity for Cambodians in their leadership. I mean, it was an important time, and it moved quickly that there were opportunities for Cambodians to provide leadership in the nonprofit sector, opportunities that weren't there just months and years before.
You to put some context, do you still remember how many offices CWS had in Asia at that time? Because we were not only in Cambodia, right? We
right.
In Vietnam as well.
We were in Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh, India, I think, maybe India. I'm not sure. Indonesia, of course. Those are the ones I can think about where we had offices.
That might be when I think back. And India and Bangladesh fairly quickly were handed over to the local NGOs.
Oh yeah, and Pakistan as well.
Pakistan, yeah. But that was, I mean, they became independent much later. Yeah. Okay, so 6 years in, and then you went back. Were you called back to New York? What happened?
Yeah, so there was I found out a new executive director at Church World Service. He came out and visited the program early on, and then a couple of months later he reached out. He actually we got a fax, because by then you weren't necessarily getting phone calls or emails, but it was, you know, maybe you were getting a fax if the lines were working. that he was on his way to North Korea and wanted to stop by Phnom Penh, which, if you know your geography, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so Rodney Page came back to Phnom Penh and talked with me about coming to New York to serve as his deputy at CWS. And so we had a good conversation. I said I would think about it. I'd get back to him. We continued the conversation, and then I decided to move to New York, which was as much a culture shock as it was moving to Cambodia in the first place.
Yeah. And I know all about it, because years later I went from Asia to New York as well, so I can relate to that. It's just for the listeners. Also, I had a conversation with Rodney Page for this podcast series, and yeah, he's definitely a storyteller. But I don't remember if he mentions this on the podcast, but I've heard him say this many times, that his best hire ever was you. There's the best move he has ever done. But he asked you to do many things, but one big task. And can you maybe explain that a bit about what happened? Because when you came, Church World Service was still part of the National Council of Churches, right?
Yeah. Well, it really was to sort of facilitate and lead the process for CWS standing on its own as a legal entity, rather than as simply as a department of the National Council of Churches. So I coordinated both the legal work and then also the negotiations and dialogue with NCC leaders as well as denominational leaders to make that possible. Yeah.
I don't envy you that you had to do this. I think ultimately everybody would have agreed that this was a good move, but that doesn't mean that it was easy. So
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. I also had another, besides the role I had, which at the time was Deputy Director for Programs and Operations.
You were also operations. Wow. Yeah.
The director of the community fundraising programs based in Elkhart also retired. And so Rodney asked me to serve as interim. So for about 8 months, I also was the interim leadership in Elkhart. So I was doing a week in Elkhart and a week in New York.
Wow.
And a week in Elkhart and a week in New York.
That's amazing. But ultimately, did you find a replacement for how was that done, or did you do this until the end, both jobs?
No. There was a replacement hired. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it didn't last that long, but while it did last, everybody in New York appreciated it, because every time I came back from Indiana, I brought an entire carton full of fresh ear corn from Indiana back to New York to the office.
That's great. That's a great story. If you look back at your period at the headquarters, outside of that you were responsible for facilitating that process, which was really significant, within the history of CWS. If we look at the programmatic issues, is there something that that you remember is you would like to lift up, or that you're proud of, or was difficult?
No, it was a time, I think, of some significant change in the support CWS was receiving from its member denominations. I know that continues today as well. And so needing to kind of rethink funding models, what kinds of programs we could support with resources from denominations as opposed to those that were supported with grant dollars from the federal or state government. it's been an ongoing process for CWS. I know doesn't just happen once and then it's over. It's just a continuing evolution and change in many ways. So it was, I will say, I think it was difficult with many of the historic partnerships that CWS had with local churches and church entities overseas who were used to being able to partner with CWS and receive significant financial dollars, financial resources to support their work. And as denominational support declined, we were less and less able to do that. And to provide that kind of assistance. The partnership and relationship was still important, but the ability to commit significant financial resources declined. Yeah. I think the other thing that was very different at that time as well is that we went through a period where we had a very strong, robust, large disaster response program, both domestically and internationally. The immigration and refugee program was smaller, and that's evolved and changed as well, both based on, I think, on a combination of need, capacity, and resources.
Yeah. No, yeah, and you're absolutely right. And within capacity, I would say also, certain people. You might try to build a system, not thinking about the people, but at the end, who do you have in certain positions is a big deal as well. I had conversations with Rick Augsburger, for example, within this series, and Donna Durr was really instrumental for CWS as well, right? So, hey, Linda, when CWS was celebrating its 50 years anniversary, a book was made called 50 Years of Help and Hope. When Church World Service celebrated 75 years, it did not make a book, and I'm trying, this kind of podcast is my effort of making something to remember all the work that we have done over the years. But if a book would have been made about 75 years of Church World Service, what kind of keywords would you have used, within the title?
Yeah. Responding or responsive, faith, community engagement, fighting hunger, advocating for justice.
What do you like about the work of CWS?
I guess in part that it is like the proverbial elephant. It's like, if you touch the ears, it feels like one thing, and you touch the trunk and it feels like something else, and you touch the tail and it feels like something entirely different. It's big and broad and beautiful, both in its parts and in its whole. And ultimately very strong and resilient. Where other organizations have fallen short or given up or completely cast off entire areas of work and response, I think CWS hasn't done that. It's evolved in the approach it takes. It's continued to, I think, improve and strengthen how it works, and has sought greater impact. But it is tenacious, and it's really, really stuck with a mission of making a difference in the lives of the neighbors that we know and the neighbors that we'll never get to meet.
I like how you described that. You are now with your second stint with CWS as interim VP, Vice President Operations, right? Is that the official title?
Right.
Yeah. when you, what are you doing differently now? Because you had left Church World Service for many different things. You were CEO of other organizations, so you've learned things there. So how did you start? How are you doing things differently now within CWS than during your first period?
Well, it's interesting when I started this kind of second career with CWS. It started last year really as a consultancy doing an assessment of the operations needs of the organization, and that was really grounded in a lot of listening, talking to a lot of people within the organization, never able to assume that I knew better than anybody else. So doing a lot of listening and looking for common threads, and where there were differences, then trying to understand why there were differences and what the best path forward might be. So I would say, when I came to CWS headquarters from Cambodia, I mean, I had an experience of CWS already in the field, which is very different from headquarters. And this time around, it really, my work started with an awful lot of listening and looking for common perceptions of need and priority for the organization. And I guess I feel part of my mandate, and it's also because I'm not in the job permanently, is to really facilitate conversations, thinking, reflection, and consideration of the functioning of the organization and how it can be strengthened, and not just sort of plowing ahead. This is my way. This is how I think it should be done, because ultimately that won't be sustained. It really has to be owned by various leaders within the organization.
If I ask you to name one colleague or a partner organization or a supporter of Church World Service who best embodies what CWS is about, who will you name and why?
Yeah, well, I've already named him, so I would name Rodney Page. And I would name him because I think he had a very clear vision for the organization, where it needed to go, yet not at the expense of history and relationships. He wasn't at all daunted at the idea of change and massive change in the organization. He was a consummate storyteller, and the stories were just not a tool for engaging somebody. The stories to Rodney, I think, are very personal, and they mean a lot to him, and so they're treasures in many ways, that he loves to share. Yeah.
And again, I totally agree with you. So folks should really check out that episode with Rodney, who was a former CEO of Church World Service. Linda, when I talk about Church World Service, I often say, I think it started as a Christian US ecumenical organization, and then it slowly evolved in a more global interfaith organization. And there are people that agree with me and others not. What about you, if you hear me say that?
I think it's not as easy to sort of characterize global organizations. The history of CWS is not just history. It's also it's how it's founded, how it's legally registered, how it's structured and organized is as an ecumenical Christian faith-based organization. At the same time, I think it's done a superb job of adapting to a broader relevant context. So, you know, no longer is it expected or required that staff be practicing Christians. No longer is it expected that partners and programs that we fund address or are only with Christian faith-based organizations or denominations. There's a much broader view, I think, of the world without sacrificing or giving up the roots of the organization.
In all my episodes, I always have a question about music as well. So I am going to ask you, similar question. If I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that best represents what Church World Service is about, which song would that be? Or piece of music, yeah.
So I would choose Bob Dylan's "The Times They Are A-Changin'."
Okay. Can you tell a little bit more, why you chose that song?
Well, because I it's true of CWS today, as CWS grows and is strengthened, evolves in the ways that it works and is organized, but it's also true of its past. If you go back to the very early days of CWS and collecting grain from farmers to help refugees, it's changed a lot. And I think the process of change, of evolution, both in how CWS works and in who we really target as those we serve who are most in need, has changed. So I think the 75 years, in fact, are a continuing cycle of change that only continues today.
Let us piggyback more on the change. We have had, and we are still having questions in terms of our brand. We came out of linked with 37 different denominations. At the same time, within those Protestant churches, Anglican churches, Orthodox churches, the number of people that are going to churches are reducing. That has an effect on our supporters as well. So we have had discussions around the brand in terms of, maybe we should not be called Church World Service, especially the word church is very loaded. How do you see that in terms of, finding future supporters? Because our present supporters are very faithful, so it's no problem at all that we are called Church World Service. But, with the younger generation, it seems to be a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would posit that even already the brand has evolved and that CWS is perhaps most commonly known as CWS, not as Church World Service. In some ways, it's kind of sad that we're reduced to an acronym, but that's what it is. So even the brand itself, without intention, can evolve and change. And I guess I would hope that going forward, we can both think about legacy, both as past, the history, the roots, the motivations that led to this organization, but also think about legacy as future. and what legacy we want to shape, what we want our legacy to be 10, 20, 30, 40, another 75 years from now, and to prepare and equip ourselves for that. And that may well mean, further shaping of the brand. But I think it's also very much about how we engage supporters, and not just the current supporters, but the supporters we aspire to have. And that we can spread the word far and wide that CWS is a really smart investment for doing good in a fractured and hurting world.
Talking about the past legacy and the future legacy, an important piece, and rightly so, I think, is at the moment, discussions around fighting injustice, and specifically racial injustice. But if you, because you have worked for Church World Service for, 2 periods, how is, if you look at our role in fighting injustice, and specifically racial injustice, how did we do, and how are we doing?
I think over much of CWS's history, racial injustice has not been understood to be part of its mission and focus. Not to say that it's unimportant by any means. Quite honestly, it's also part of the history of the relationship with the National Council of Churches, who had a strong mandate and emphasis and work in the area of fighting racial injustice, in support of the civil rights movement and the like. So that was always seen as someone else's responsibility. I think with time now, there's a greater sense of a role for CWS. Certainly the racial justice platform that CWS has adopted is important. And I think keeping in mind that work like this has to start at home. It's not about, we can be the great proponent of racial justice overseas somewhere, but it needs to and is starting at home within CWS as an organization, among our staff, among our member churches, and in the communities where we're connected to local churches and other entities. So my sense is it will probably be only work that grows, but I hope we do a good job of it at home first before we try to tackle it more broadly.
Yeah, we talked about Rodney being a good storyteller. I do want to ask you, to share an anecdote maybe, or an experience that best describes your time with CWS, or a memory. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but it will be nice to hear something.
Yeah, well, it doesn't put me on the spot because it's a story I've told many times after my work for CWS in Cambodia. And it's really about humility and learning from the people that we serve. Early in my tenure in Cambodia, I traveled down to Svay province near the border with Vietnam, where we had community development work. And I made the trip because we were going to be dedicating a new school that had been built by the local community with support from Church World Service. So it was a big deal for this community and a big deal for CWS. And we had the ceremonies and the flowers and the dancing and the speeches and all of the things that go along with dedicating a new school in a Cambodian context. And then there was a meal, and the community, the women in particular, of course, had been working hard to prepare a meal for us. And it was rice and soup, and soup out of a big cauldron that had been cooking for a long time. And I got my bowl of soup and my rice and sat down to eat it. And I was hungry. I looked down in my bowl, and floating on the top of my soup were curled up little red ants. And I'm not particularly fond of insects, but anyways, so I, as privately and carefully as I could, used my spoon to kind of scoop up some of the ants and flip them out of the soup bowl, and hoping it wouldn't be noticed, but it was. Someone from the community asked me what was wrong, and I said, "Oh, well, don't worry about it, no problem. There are just some ants in my soup." And the woman explained to me that they were there on purpose. They were there as a flavoring, as a spice, and that they had worked very hard to go out into the forest to collect them, so that they could be put as garnish on the soup for this special occasion. And of course, I felt horrible then for what I'd done, but it was an important lesson to learn that my perception of something was totally wrong, and that my hosts and the local community had been doing something wise and kind and generous, and that I needed to be more open to learning from them.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I didn't know that about red ants. Yeah, although I've eaten a lot of things that we normally don't eat in Kalimantan, Indonesia and stuff, but never that. No, that's a great story, Linda. Thanks for that. Yeah, funny. We have talked about the elephant. We have talked about the ant now. So, and they often have stories together, right? Hey, yeah, is there anything that you would like to say or want to wish for CWS? It almost seems like, at the end of the month, you're done, right? Or is that correct?
No, not well, whenever someone is hired into
whenever someone is hired. So I don't want to push it. Almost like now I was like, oh, this seems like a farewell question, but I'm asking this to everybody. So yeah, any wish for CWS?
Yeah, I mean, it's really that CWS continues to be open to change, to feel called to meet human need wherever it might be, that the staff of CWS feel inspired and valued every day, knowing that they're making a real difference in the work that they do, and that CWS continues to reflect God's love for all people in all of its work.
Is there anything that I should have asked you about CWS that I didn't?
No, I don't think so. And if so, I wouldn't tell you.
Okay. Hey, Linda, thank you so much. I mean, first of all, for hiring me, because I haven't told the listeners, but that's how my career with Church World Service started. I mean, you hired me as the country representative for Indonesia, and the rest is history, because many years later, I'm still around.
Yes.
And it has, for me, it has been definitely a blessing and a great journey. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for today and for sharing your stories, for being who you are, and for all the work and dedication that you have given to Church World Service.
Thanks so much. My pleasure, and it's really been my privilege to to have the opportunity to work with CWS and to be a supporter in bigger ways and small ways.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Do you see you? Do you see me? Will you be the eyes so that we all can be?
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And if you want to know more about Church World Service, please check out cwsglobal.org. Thank you.